So this ends our series on Elijah, and this passage is all about change. And change is one of the least favorite topics that people like to talk about, really, because change is one of everybody's least favorite things. Like there's the old joke, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is one, but it has to really want to change. Well, there's like the Lutheran version of that, which is how many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is change. But really, you could say that about human beings in general. We like the things that we are familiar with. Because if we are familiar with something, we know how it works, we have, real or imagined, a sense of mastery over it. Like imagine, a production line in a factory, and all the people know their roles, all of these procedures are in place, all the machines doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. That is comfortable because you know what is supposed to happen. You know how to make it work. But then you start changing things in that process. Technology comes in or something, and now all of a sudden you have no, real or imagined, control over it. You don't know what's going to happen next. You've got to relearn. It's very uncomfortable. Or in like a family situation or a situation of relationships, you know how to approach people in certain things for different, or in certain ways for different things. Well, don't bring that topic up with her, or don't approach him like that. You've got to be nicer about it or something. That when things are familiar, you know how to get things done. But if somebody changes, even if they change for the better, it throws the whole system out of whack. It's a good thing, but it's hard. Change is difficult, but it is also inevitable. So to really get to where we're headed, we have to go back either a couple of chapters or a couple weeks if you're looking at the Bible or the sermon series, because a lot of this starts when Elijah has this big showdown with the prophets of Baal. They were infecting the people of Israel. And this, like we said, isn't about like a differing religious opinion, but worship of Baal, this Canaanite fertility god, was a cancer that was killing Israel. Worship of Baal involved things like child sacrifice and forced ritualistic temple prostitution. This is dark stuff. They had to be eradicated. And so they have this showdown, and whoever's God shows up is the true God and wins. And of course, Baal's prophets do their thing and nothing happens. Then the true God, the God of Israel, the God of Elijah, shows up. And he then orders that these Baal prophets die. Well, Queen Jezebel of Israel is not really excited that all of her prophets were just killed. So she puts a hit out on Elijah's life, and he gets out of town, and he escapes all the way to the wilderness and makes his way down to Mount Sinai. And he is at a low point in life. He is pouring his heart out to God, and he is angry for good reason. He had been a zealous prophet, and that's true. He is one of those prophets that just speak truth to power. They hit hard, that zeal, that energy. If he needs to bring violence to something to accomplish what God wants, he will. And so he is now at this low point because, as he said to God, I've done everything, and yet nothing has changed. And I am alone. Israel is still worshiping Baal. Just kill me now, basically. And so then you have in this famous moment, the Spirit of God is going to pass by Elijah. And he hears like earthquakes and wind and fire, but God is not in any of those. And then a quiet breeze blows, and he recognizes God is in the quiet breeze. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, rabbis, ancient and modern, picked up on the fact that those first three geological events, the earthquakes and the wind blowing and the fire, in a lot of ways represent Elijah. He, again, is this hard-hitting prophet who will speak truth to power and get up in your face because that's what was needed. But then when God is present in that slow or that quiet breeze, that represents Elisha. And that at this moment, it shows that God is done doing things the way Elijah did, even though that was fine. That was what God wanted. And now he is going to do something different. And Elisha, his successor, was much more of a shepherd of Israel. He was not a violent person. He was a lot more compassionate. And so when Elijah recognizes that God is in this cool breeze or this quiet breeze, God says again, Elijah, what's going on? And he pours his heart out. He is angry with God. And then God says to Elijah, anoint that guy king over there, anoint that guy king over there, and find this guy named Elisha. He will then be the prophet. And it represents this shift, that no longer are we going to do things this way, in that in-your-face kind of violent, zealous way, but instead God is now sending a shepherd who is a little quieter, calmer, a little more compassionate. What's interesting is that between the time when Elijah anoints Elisha, yes, that's tricky, and I'll probably mix it up at some point today, when Elijah anoints Elisha as his successor, to the time in our reading, is about 6 or 7 years difference. And I think that gives us at least a little insight in how to handle change properly. Like if you are running up to a point of big dramatic change, that is going to go best when you have already been preparing for it, recognizing in wisdom that all things are going to change at some point. That maybe living as a disciple of God, like following Jesus, loving others in your church, in your community, understanding that God could change directions at any point. Like that is a way to prepare for these moments of change. And so when Elijah finds Elisha, initially Elisha doesn't really buy it. But when he realizes that this is God's call, he's plowing a field. He's got this big plow and these oxen, and he slaughters the oxen, uses the wood from the plow to cook the meat, and shares the meat. The symbol being that he has now severed ties with his old way of life, and he's bought into this idea that he will be God's prophet. But then for 6 or 7 years, Elisha follows Elijah. He is Elijah's disciple. He is learning what it means to be a prophet, learning what it means to follow God. He is putting his time in, knowing that there will come a day of great change, but not yet. So sometimes the best way to deal with change is to be ready for it, even when you don't know when it's going to come. And so now we get to the big moment that God is going to take Elijah up. And did you notice that repetition there in the reading? Like a bunch of times, Elijah's saying, I'm going here, stay here. And Elisha clings to him and says, no, as surely as the Lord lives, which is an oath. Like, I am going to stay with you. This is a very tender thing to do. Elisha loves his spiritual father, Elijah. This is like the same kind of language that Ruth spoke to Naomi when they were living in a foreign land and their lives fell apart. She's saying, no, I am going to stay with you because I love you. And so a couple of times, then Elisha follows Elijah. And did you notice also a couple of times a bunch of prophets say to Elisha, hey, God's going to take your master. And then what does Elisha say? He says, yeah, I know. Let's not talk about it. I have no idea why that is, just so you know. I could not find a commentator that really gave a good explanation. So let your imagination take over, but not too much. And so what you see here is this Elisha who loves and cares for Elijah. He likes the way God is doing things right now. And he is clinging to him until the time comes for Elijah to be taken. And then Elijah says to Elisha, ask me anything, and I'll give it to you. And he asked for a double portion of his spirit. Now, this seems to be a reference to the way inheritance worked in the Old Testament and in the time of Jesus. Your father would give to the firstborn son the double portion, like the lion's share, so to speak, and then the other siblings kind of divide it up. And this would be land, and money is usually tied to land and resources and that kind of thing. So Elisha is really asking, give me the double portion, make me your heir. Now, just as an aside, I think actually that's a good way to deal with inheritance. The father gives the firstborn son, the lion's share of what he has. And I say that because I am the firstborn son of my family. And my brother's a doctor. He doesn't need it, but whatever. But this is Elisha saying, make me the prophet like you, but even more so. So Elijah is saying, you don't know what you're asking. I mean, Elijah almost lost his life. But he says, if you see me when I go up, then God has given it to you. And Elisha lets go. He was clinging to Elijah until it was time, and then he let go. What an amazing vision of what it takes to handle change. You cling to what's familiar, but having the wisdom to let go when it's time. So Elijah is taken up, and he takes his cloak, or in other translations, mantle. So the phrase passing the mantle actually comes from this passage in English. And he is then taking on the mantle of Elijah. He is now the prophet. And when he runs into these 50 other prophets, they recognize that the Spirit of God is now with Elisha. He has Elijah's prophetic spirit. Now, what we don't see, because it occurs in the next couple of verses, is another darker aspect of change. Because these prophets then say to Elisha, well, we weren't sure. Let's go looking for him. Let's go find Elijah. There we go. Let's go find Elijah. We've got 50 of us. There's enough to find him. And Elisha says, no, that's over. When we experience change, how often do we look back and say, well, can we just go back to that? That was better. What we're really saying was, I had that figured out because it was familiar. But Elisha has the wisdom to recognize that God has changed things, and so it is time to move forward. Now, I struggled with this message because this was a big moment in the history of Israel. Like, this passing of the prophetic mantle is huge. But realistically, how many times in your lives is that big moment of change occurring? That big moment where you pass the mantle off, that it is time for that person to then take over? Not very many times. Like, this is like your kid graduates from high school and then goes off to college and lives much more independently. Your kid goes off and gets married, and now they're starting a family of their own. That's where you've got to recognize that you don't have the control or the say that you wished you had or you used to have, that mantle has to be passed. Like, those are really big moments in life. Like the new job out of state, passing the mantle for your old job and receiving a new mantle for your new one. Having a child, you're receiving the mantle to care for this new life. It doesn't happen all that often. But if you think about it longer, you realize there are little mantles all over the place. I've had to learn this a lot as a parent. My son is 5, he's still in preschool, but as he's grown, he's become more independent, which is good. But it's kind of hard. I mean, you have like those intimate moments where you would feed him and you would hold him and just kind of, sing softly to him, and they were these wonderful, tender moments. But then he learns to feed himself. He learns to put on his own clothes. And especially my kid, he has opinions on what he's going to wear. I don't get to control that anymore. There are these little moments where I'm all right, passing the mantle. All right, bud, that's your choice. I've got to accept that. Your kids get older, or your kids are now at the age where you can't really give them a curfew anymore, even though you're sure it would be good for them. They're too old. You've got to pass that mantle along and say, you're in charge now of that area of your life. Responsibilities shift at work. And even though you know that this is how things need to be done, this is how you've done it, this is how it should be done, this is the best way to do it, not your job anymore. That mantle gets passed because now you've got to focus this way. Or in kind of a reverse, maybe you or your parents are getting older. They're not as independent or as well as they used to be. It's time for them to pass that mantle back. Maybe they shouldn't be driving. These little mantles happen all the time. And they're all kind of hard. Change is inevitable. I mean, think about, our church. Like right now, we've got our pastoral staff together. Like you've got your leaders now after, there's vacancies and all of that. Pastor Scott has been here for over 3 years. I've been here for a little over a year now. We've got our thing. But there will come a time when that changes. Now, just FYI, I'm not sitting with a call in my back pocket. I'm not leaving or anything like that. Don't act so disappointed. But by the fact that we are a community here means that we will experience change. Mantles will have to be passed. Our responsibilities, the ways that we serve our community, the way we serve our families will change. These little mantles get passed, and God grant us the wisdom of Elisha to cling to what we love and let go when it is time. God grants us the wisdom to prepare, to understand that life is going to change, and pass the mantle when it's time. So we talked also a few weeks ago how because Elijah was taken up, he didn't die. He's still kind of alive in some sense. I don't totally understand it. But the prophets would talk about how when God sends his Messiah, his anointed one who will save us from ourselves, he will first send somebody in the spirit of Elijah, or maybe even Elijah himself. The rabbis are wrestled with that over time to prepare that way. So Jews, ancient and modern, when they celebrate Passover, and it was a tradition that when Elijah comes, he'll come at Passover, that they will pour a cup of wine for Elijah in case this is the year that he comes. And I would regularly ask a friend of mine who's Jewish after Passover, did Elijah come? And he would say, no, but somebody drank his wine. Go figure. And considering my friend's Hebrew name is Eliyahu, or Elijah, I have my suspicions. But as the New Testament unfolds, we find out that that's John the Baptist. And John the Baptist had the spirit of Elijah. He spoke truth to power. He was like that old school, Old Testament prophet. He would run his mouth and got thrown in prison for his troubles. But there's an interesting moment that I think runs parallel to what we were just talking about. In John chapter 3, when John the Baptist's disciples were asking about Jesus. They were doing ministry in one place, Jesus was doing ministry in another place. And John the Baptist says, look, I told you I am not the Messiah. He is. Therefore, I must decrease, and he must increase. Now, it's hard to say for sure, but there's an ancient body of Jewish writing called the Zohar, attributed to this guy named Shimon Bar Yochai, in case you're ever on Jeopardy or something. And it's ancient. It's hard to say exactly how ancient, but at the very least, he's drawing in this very imaginative way, I think, concepts that were floating around at the time of Jesus and beyond. And he was imagining and drawing a parallel, or a parable, in his imagination about like how when the sun and the moon were created, that originally in his imagination, God created the sun and the moon as equals. And the moon became arrogant and approached God and said, God, make me greater than the sun. And God then said, because you have asked this, you must decrease, and the sun will increase, and you will serve the sun. Now, it's an imaginative parable. It's definitely ancient, but it seems like John the Baptist is drawing from some of that wisdom. Because if you do not recognize when God is changing things, he will change things whether you want it to or not. That one of the hardest things to do is to watch somebody resist almost violently the things that are changing in their lives, because then we tend to become control freaks. We can't let go when it's time. But John the Baptist has this special wisdom, recognizing like Elijah that his time is up. And like Elisha, Jesus takes center stage. And Jesus is much more in the spirit of Elisha. He is much more of the shepherd. He is compassionate. He is gentle. And one of the things that just moves me about Jesus' life is that he was given everything. He said, like, he was given the mantle of John the Baptist. He says that all authority on heaven and on in heaven and on earth has been given to him. He was given this tremendous power over our bodies and over nature itself. And whatever Jesus is given, he does not hold on to. Instead, he gives it away. To his disciples, he then gives that authority in heaven and on earth. His powers over nature and over our bodies, he uses to heal those who are broken physically and spiritually. That whatever Jesus has, he gives away. That as God changes the way he deals with humanity from John the Baptist to Jesus, just like Elijah to Elisha, that change, that passing of the mantle, gives us something that we never saw coming. Now, Jesus and Elisha are not just good examples. I mean, if I were to say, therefore, everything that you've been given should be given away, always let go of things that you can't control, and realize change is going to happen, good luck, you would say, thanks, Pastor, that's really tough, and so I'm going to go out and feel bad about myself. But Jesus just doesn't serve as an example, because he also gives himself up, his own life. And the same spirit that animated Jesus, that drove him to this selfless giving, is also at work in us. That when change happens and that mantle is passed, that may feel like, and it really does represent, a kind of death. And wherever God kills, he also makes alive. Just as Jesus goes to his grave and takes our selfishness and our sinfulness with him, he also raises Jesus and raises us inside. So it is not just that Jesus is this example of somebody who handled change well and gave himself up, but he is actively inside of you. His spirit is working, it is regenerating, it is raising that dead in you, so that when change comes, you're gonna be okay. If Jesus can receive everything and give it up, and his spirit is alive in you, that when it comes time for the little or the big mantles to be passed, you really can do the same. Because you live by the power of God's very Spirit. When it comes time to pass the mantle, may you give it up, knowing that the same Spirit that drove Elijah to give it to Elisha, or drove John the Baptist to give it to Jesus, who then gave it to the world, empowers you as well. This is your spiritual inheritance. Let's pray.